Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my ranking videos, worst to best, and today I'm going to look at the mighty Led Zeppelin. I'll ask you now to click like, subscribe and click that bell so you're notified of any future uploads. And if you like my musings on music, do check out my Patreon page, there's lots of extra content on there. I'll start off this video, as I always do, by saying these are my own personal preferences, which may of course differ from yours. Please leave your list down below. And number 9 is Coda from 1982. Not really a Led Zeppelin studio album as such, it's really just a collection of sort of offcuts. It's very much in that tradition of sort of well-regarded leftover albums. The Stones' Tattoo You would be a prime example. I suspect with this album there was somebody that just wanted to make a bit of extra money on the Led Zeppelin names to kind of squeeze this one out. It's it's a collection of B-side material, jams, offcuts that have been assembled for this record. You know, you get songs like you get the bluesy "We're Gonna Groove," "Poor Tom," and I think from the Led Zeppelin 2 sessions we get "I Can't Quit You Baby." But I think it's fair to say that most of the tracks off this are essentially bits that were left off In Through the Outdoor and Presence. Overall it's a bit of a disparate mishmash really, one for the completists only. And number 8 is In Through the Outdoor from 1979. For many, this album reflects the personal turmoil that was very much defined the band while they were recording this album. You've also got to think about the topography of the musical landscape at the time. You had NME, of course, were on a vitriolic campaign to constantly sort of present bands like Led Zeppelin as bloated and representative of everything that was wrong with rock music. You had, of course, outside the Led Zeppelin bubble, you had disco, which had seized the hearts and minds and trousers of a generation, and the phlegmy nihilism of punk had certainly announced itself. But also you've got to remember, on the horizon you had all that sort of very minimalistic electronic stuff, like Tube Army and Visage, dubbed futuristic at the time. All this stuff was in the post as well. The musical landscape was certainly shifting. It was an album that was made during very trying times for the band, with certainly Page and Bonham sort of spiralling to sort of alcohol and sort of substance abuse. It was very much left to John Paul Jones and Plant to very much piece together what would become this album. It's quite an odd album in many respects, and many sort of stated that it's a far cry from the monstrous blues that the band had unleashed upon the public sort of 10 years prior. There's certainly no doubt the band wanted to sort of explore different sonic textures and territories for this record. There's it's certainly a sense of oral adventurism, if you like, although even, despite the sort of tensions that were going on in the band at the time, certainly John Paul Jones notches up quite a few writing credits on this one. You get songs like All My Love, of course, which is a favourite of the casual Zepp listener, as well as being a favourite of sort of daytime FM radio. The sort of rockabilly throwaway of Hot Dog, and Fool in the Rain, which is very much a standout track for me. I think John Bonham is absolutely incredible on this song, and Jimmy Page's multi-octave guitar solo is absolutely sublime. Another interesting track on this album is I'm Going to Crawl. It was described by one critic as a throwback to Zeppelin's past on an album that suggests a future that never materialises. Number 7 is Presence from 1976, an album that's worth buying simply for Achilles' Last Stand alone. It's a 10-minute beast of a song that ranks up there with Zeppelin's best work. Interestingly, Jimmy Page said he was trying to create the facade of a Gothic building with layers of tracery and statues. But the song is interesting as well because it's very autobiographical. It was actually dubbed the wheelchair song because Robert Plant was recovering from a road accident at the time. This song, of course, speaks of a lot of the frustrations the band were experiencing at the time. There were also tax exiles, which forced the band to become what Jimmy Page termed technological gypsies. But also worth noting is Jimmy Page's guitar solo on this track. It's absolutely fantastic and certainly ranks up with the more popular Stairway to Heaven. I love the track T for One. It has a languid quality. It's very much a rechanneling of Since I've Been Loving You, as classic rock has pointed out. This song, its beauty lies very much in the atmosphere it evokes. It creates a simmering and easy grace as you listen to it. It's very much a song written by Robert Plant, I believe, which spoke about his separation from his wife and children at the time. For Your Life is also a noteworthy track that sees the band railing against the LA lifestyle they probably once enjoyed. It's a bleak album in many respects. I particularly like the song Nobody's Fault But Mine. It has a great riff which was originally written by Blind Willie Johnson in 1928. The story goes that Blind Willie Johnson was terrified of losing his eyesight, as he would no longer be able to read his Bible. I think Robert Plant sees this as a befitting metaphor for the state of the band at the time, as it was sort of facing darkness and dissent. Presence is a strange creature, really, that draws upon its own internal tensions for its inspiration. It's an album where Jimmy Page very much seizes the reins for this one, and consequently we get an album that's swirling with sort of guitar-heavy complexity. In fact, one critic has written, "It's perched halfway between a return to roots and unfettered prog." But often at times it's this dichotomy on Led Zeppelin albums that make them interesting. I mean, some of the other tracks on it, for example, Royal Orleans, Candy Store Rock, Hot Song for Nowhere, on the initial run-through of this album, these feel like sort of throwaway songs, and I say on the initial run-through because you re-listen to this album, these tracks really reward the listener. They're actually quite rich and interesting numbers. But despite all the other songs that are actually featured on this album, they're all kind of eclipsed by Achilles' Last Stand with its moody majesty and epic posturing. But for me, I also like the songs that very much channel the angst and dysfunction of the time. Songs like Nobody's Fault But Mine and For Your Life, a sharp, dramatic, honest rendering of the period. Number 6 is Led Zeppelin from 1969. When Peter Grant ceased to manage the Nashville Teens and started to overlook the affairs of the Yardbirds, the rock landscape was never quite the same. Led Zeppelin, of course, rises from the ashes that was the new Yardbirds, which were formerly the Yardbirds, a band that had very much risen to the fore as part of that sort of British blues explosion. A band that had also dabbled with the vagaries of psychedelia, of course, before becoming the new Yardbirds, before transmogrifying into the colossus that is Zeppelin. The eponymous debut album takes the electric blues of Hendrix and Cream and sort of infuses it with a psychosexual frenzy. But it was an album that was as nuanced as it was brutal. It was shaded and textured, filled with alternating dynamics and tempos, as classic rock has so eloquently pointed out. But as I said, it was definitely brutal. I mean, Good Times, Bad Times, it feels like a physical assault, with John Bonham's drum hitting you right in the chest like a lightning bolt from the blue. It's a varied album that fluctuates between the psychedelic blues of Dazed and Confused to the anthemic Your Time Is Going to Come and the pure English folk of Black Mountain Side. And let's not forget Dazed and Confused becomes the perfect vehicle for the band live, which showcases Jimmy Page's guitar skills with long improvisations. And Robert Plant's voice is absolutely angelic on this album. It's stratospheric, in fact, especially on the track Babe, I'm Going to Leave You. It was an album that was recorded over 9 days at the cost of about £1,780 or thereabouts. It fluctuates between the frenetic and powerful communication breakdown to the ferocity that was brought to sort of Willie Dixon staples like You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You, Babe. Good Times, Bad Times with that deluge of drumming perfectly epitomises the Zeppelin sound at the time. You get that flurry of spitting guitar notes and growling vocals. All sort of wrapped up with some heavy-duty riffage. There's no doubt that this album's sonic architecture is absolutely astonishing, from its opening track to its final How Many More Times, which was a composition very much based on Howlin' Wolf's How Many More Years. If we consider the subsequent albums, of course, there's no doubt about it, they have a higher quantity of classic songs. But I think it's fair to say that none of them has that feeling of a new band announcing itself with such a raw, brutal and visceral fashion. Number 5 is Led Zeppelin 2 from 1969. It's an album that provides the blueprint for heavy metal, according to the editor of AllMusic. Not sure I agree with that, to be honest with you, but nevertheless it's an album that sees the band moving away from that sort of blues roots to produce an album that's more diverse, more textured, and certainly, I think, more interesting than their debut. According to Jimmy Page, it's an album that captures the energy of being on the road. It was a statement of intent from a young band. Robert Plant has described this album as flamboyant and carnal, and my God, he's certainly not wrong there. It's one that seems to establish that blueprint of that open-shirted rock god, lemon-squeezing swagger that we've come to expect from them. Zeppelin 2, of course, comprises lots of songs that Page had written specifically for the band. They weren't just numbers pulled over from his days in the Yardbirds. It also contains A Whole Lot of Love, a song described by classic rock as boundary-breaking innovation. That primal growl contained in the riff is very much the band's barbaric yop, as far as I'm concerned. with its effects-laden midsection which sails perilously close to freeform jazz. There's certainly no doubt that this album is iconic, as are most of the songs contained thereon. We get the priapic Lemon song, of course, from Plant, and the wonderful Ramble On, which lulls us before exploding into life. These are just some of the highlights on this record. Interestingly, actually, I read an article recently that Plant was embarrassed by all the Tolkien references on the Led Zeppelin albums. But I think it was just very much in keeping with the time. There was that very much back to nature vibe that he was very much in vogue back then. You can obviously see that in Plant's love of sort of people like Joni Mitchell, and of course from this side of the pond, of course, you get the incredible string band. The sound on this album is gloriously heavy and not as dense, I think, as its predecessor. But then, that might have been down to the sort of distance miking technique that the band were using while they were recording this one. The raunch and strut of this album make it a compelling listen. It's certainly more brutal, more direct in many ways. And I think it sounds a lot better than the original album, as I've said. A lot of the riffs on this album were sort of riffs borrowed from some classic blues songs. But, of course, these songs also had extended sections for sort of excellent improvisations live. There's no doubt this album lays down a clear marker of the band's intent and where they were headed, and certainly packs a bigger punch in terms of its sound and influence. Number 4 is Houses of the Holy from 1973. This is the album, of course, that brings us the Rain song, that beautiful sort of layered riposte to George Harrison. Of course, we get the Ocean, of course, with that iconic riff, a riff that's been appropriated, shall we say, by quite a few artists since then. And the wonderful Song Remains the Same. This album to me feels like very much a natural progression. It still has lots of those sort of folky hooks that we got on its predecessor, but it's not without its more muscular numbers either. Overall, I think there's a more open atmosphere and a musical diversity on this one that makes it a thoroughly interesting listen. But there's also a darkness inherent on this one as well, in the song No Quarter. We must doff our caps to John Paul Jones for the arrangements and writing of this one, I think. Certainly one of my favourite songs on this album is Over the Hills and Far Away, which has been described as folk metal fusion by some. There's certainly no doubt that at this point this was the band at their creative peak. There was no doubt a different atmosphere on this record, a more open atmosphere in many respects, if I can describe it as that. The engineer, of course, Eddie Kramer, said the whole album had a more upbeat quality to it, a much brighter sound than the earlier Zeppelin albums. And this is certainly an album that benefits from all the band members installing sort of personal studios in their own homes, of course, which means we've got more sort of complex and sophisticated arrangements. If we're talking about this album, we cannot not mention The Song Remains the Same, a wonderful song that started off as called The Campaign and the Overture. It was only when Plant started writing lyrics for it that it's transformed from an instrumental or mere instrumental into the wonderful opus it becomes, a sort of poem to the music of the world. If we talk about this album, of course, we must talk about the cover. The cover these days creates quite a stir, as everyone seems to be a lot more squeamish about the idea of images of naked children. But then it was certainly very much keeping with the sort of 1960s, the idea of childhood, uncorrupted innocence, and naked children being a perfect expression of purity in many respects. I mean, we think of the Blind Faith album cover as well. It was an attitude, of course, that was certainly very much apparent in the British Romantic movement that was sort of reborn in the 1960s as it rejected those sort of buttoned-up post-war sort of moralities. The cover, of course, was designed by Hypnosis, but of course you know that. Interesting, I had this as a Facebook banner for my Classic Rock album page, my Facebook page, but Facebook made me take it down, as it said it didn't permit images of naked children. So I replaced it instead with a picture of Jerry Garcia, Captain Trips. Number 3 is Led Zeppelin 3 from 1970. Now, it's hard to believe that this album is considered to be a bit of a disappointment back in the day, but for me, I never sort of got past that wonderful sort of swirling wheel sleeve. I thought it was fabulous. But this is, often seen as the acoustic album, a song that boasts songs like Friends, Gallows Pole, of course, and Tangerine. Now, Tangerine's one of my favourite Zeppelin numbers. I love the solo on this one. But it's not without its bluster and thunder as well. The Immigrant Song springs to mind, and of course Celebration Day. Now, Celebration Day was described by one critic as sounding like a berserk slinky. There's certainly 6 of the 10 tracks on this album were built around Jimmy Page's wonderful ear for acoustic nuances and harmonies. We get the, if I may refer to my notes, we get songs like Gallows Pole, which certainly has a whiff of bluegrass about it. The country blues of Hats Off to Roy Harper. Now, Roy Harper was an incredibly influential artist in the late 60s, early 70s. Ian Anderson has cited him as an influence. And Bron Ra Stomp, of course. Certainly some more authentic sounding acoustic forays were very much in vogue at the time. I trace that back to sort of Dylan's rejection of the swirling vagaries of psychedelia to embrace a more sort of authentic rootsy Americana when him and the band convened in New York to produce what would become the Basement Tapes. Of course, we get bands after that like Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young, the Flying Burrito Brothers. And this side of the pond, of course, we've got the incredible string band with that sort of clay pipe cardi wearing stuff going on there. Interestingly, this band Led Zeppelin were accused of trying to sound like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young on this one. A review that so incensed Jimmy Page that he refused to grant any sort of press interviews for about 18 months afterwards. Certainly the rustic Led Zeppelin seemed to transform themselves for this album, sporting all manner of facial hair, almost sort of cultivating a look that would be later honed by those rock gods, the Wurzels. But there's no doubt there's something very distinctly Middle-earth about the band during this period. Certainly there's no denying the acoustic roots of this album. I mean, a lot of the acoustic influences very much rise to the fore. Jimmy Page has cited he was very much influenced by people like Bert Jansch. Apparently I read some of that he was even experimenting with sitars long before the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. I'm not sure if that's true or not. We only have to look at some of the other Led Zeppelins to see those influences rising to the fore. For example, Black Mountain Side featured an Indian tabla musician. Babe, I'm Going to Leave You was a merging of a Joan Baez song with sort of rock power chords, along with a very sort of flamenco style guitar sound. For me, one of the highlights on this album is Gallows Pole. It was a song, I think, that was borrowed very much from a sort of folk tradition. It was a reinterpretation of a centuries-old English folk song called The Maid Freed from the Gallows. I think it just needed that sort of Zeppelin twist to it. It's a wonderful album that just oozes a very natural sort of bucolic quality, as well as regaling us with that wonderful spinny thing. Number 2 is Physical Graffiti from 1975. And what a colossal slab of hernia-inducing vinyl this is. It's a remarkable sort of collection. I love the lascivious funk of Custard Pie. I use the adjective lascivious, of course, because you can go and look up the meaning behind this song. This is a family show, after all. And, of course, I love the wonderful tempo shifts of In My Time of Dying. For me, on this album, it's clear that Led Zeppelin was certainly broadening their outlook. And the way Plant uses his voice on this album gives each song a very distinctive individual identity. Some critics have viewed this album as a kind of a gut response to the opaque lyricism and prog pretensions of Houses of the Holy. Others, of course, merely guffawed at the band's cerebral cock rock. But then the critics never seemed to like Led Zeppelin, did they? It's an album that in places is gorgeously heavy, but it's also very diverse and thought-provoking. Many of the songs, of course, are reworkings of earlier tracks that the band didn't use on their previous albums, but that doesn't in any way distract from the overall quality of this record. Certainly by this point the band didn't want to be just viewed as amped up Delta blues sort of imitators, and of course this album takes them along some very sort of strange avenues and thoroughfares. We get forays into some elegant sort of acoustic moments. We get country rock, Dixieland blues, and even some prog pretensions on some of the arrangements and explorations. Of course, one of the tracks that really springs to mind, of course, is Kashmir, with its core identity being provided by John Bonham's excellent and powerful drumming, and that very sort of Middle Eastern sounding sort of guitar riff from Jimmy Page, of course. Not to mention the very swirling orchestral sort of orchestral flourishes as well. There's no doubt Physical Graffiti is a sprawling and ambitious work. A lot of the tracks are very individual and nuanced. We get the wonderful Trampled Underfoot, of course, with John Paul Jones' galloping keyboard, and the remarkable monstrous epic that is The Rover. The album also explores some very interesting forays into the sort of acoustic domain as well. We get the very affecting 10 Years Gone, for example. When it comes to this album, you listen to it, you can almost say there's something for everybody on this one. Number 1 is Led Zeppelin 4 from 1971. This is my go-to Led Zeppelin album in terms of its influence, its impact, and what classic rock calls that intrinsic sense of Zeppishness. I mean, John Paul Jones' arrangements on this one certainly rise to the fore. Plant's honeyed vocals are absolutely pristine, especially during that sort of vocal jousting with the lovely Fairport warbler Sandy Denny. It remains arguably the most admired work. I love the Bonham-driven rock and roll. One critic has described it as possessing the biggest fuck-off drum sound in rock. And we get the sheer audacity and fearlessness of Black Dog, a song that appropriates its riff from a Muddy Waters number. For me, this album feels like a fusing of the sort of harder rock elements of Led Zeppelin 2 with the more acoustic meanderings of Led Zeppelin 3. It's almost a little bit schizophrenic in that respect. But it's an album that's imbued with subtlety and restraint, as well as the more muscular sort of trouser-tightening numbers as well. This album, of course, is untitled. I mean, I call it Led Zeppelin 4, but it's often referred to as The Ruins or The Four Symbols, whatever takes your fancy, I guess. This album, in many ways, is a kind of a fusing of sort of mysticism, rock, blues, as well as a sort of folky elements, which all sort of combines to produce one of the most monolithic albums of the 1970s. And it's that fusing of hard rock with a sort of mystical English folk sensibility which gives this album its broader palette and its epic scope, in my opinion. Certainly Plant's interest in sort of Tolkien and sort of Celtic mythology are very, very much apparent on this album. It gives it a very hippie-ish, bucolic vibe to it. And the Battle of Evermore is such a beautiful sort of nuanced number, of course, with the haunting vocals from Sandy Denny. Of course, that's not forgetting the overplayed and epic Stairway to Heaven with that lovely sort of acoustic finger-picking that rises to that crescendo. Classic rockers describe Stairway to Heaven as a song that teases and caresses and climaxes with nothing less than the world's greatest guitar solo ever. Of course, that's debatable, isn't it? This sort of mysticism and sort of folk fusion, rock, hard rock, all this sort of merges together in many respects to give this album a real sense of drama. There's no doubt about it, in the mixing of this album, the band was certainly aware of displayed a supreme understanding of rock dynamics. Interestingly, of course, while they were recording this album, Jethro Tull were recording Aqualung in the adjacent studio. Now, part of this album was actually recorded at Headley Grange. Now, Headley Grange was famously haunted, which very much contributes to the atmosphere of the record. Not for the last time, of course, a spirit would try to impose itself on the Led Zeppelin legacy. I love the ambience of this record. It positively saturates the mix. The mix isn't perfect, of course. We get lots of, I've noted down, lots of squeaks, scrapes and sort of microphone bleed. But this was all part of the production ethos of this album. It adds to the character and sort of feel of it all. I love Misty Mountaintop. It's built around that beautiful sort of piano riff by John Paul Jones before Bonham comes sort of charging in. And we get that lovely Going to California, a song about being busted in the park, I think, as Robert Plant has talked about. Very much an ode to Joni Mitchell. Certainly one of the most interesting numbers on this album is that reinterpretation, the hard rock reinterpretation of the Memphis Mini number, When the Levee Breaks. It's a perfect slice of sort of apocalyptic urban blues. Its seismic rhythms and layered dynamics illustrate perfectly why this band was so special, and of course why Lester Bangs was so wrong. This album, with its remarkable arrangements and its mystically obscured sleeve, for many they see it as the pinnacle of the band's craft. In fact, Robert Plant says himself, the fourth album, that's it. Anyway, you've been watching another ranking video from Classic Album Review. Please click like and subscribe. Check out the Facebook page. But more importantly, please do keep listening.